All right, everybody, good afternoon. My name is Rashad Johnson. I am going to be giving a discussion on the use of role-playing games as a tool for building social connections. Before I start, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on myself. For starters, I am an educator at Baltimore City. I teach special education at the Baltimore Lab School, where I work as an instruction assistant. Some of the things there, some of the skills that I possess there that are of great use include my ability to tell stories, my background as a game artist and game designer, my ability to teach more effectively to those who particularly have trouble with memory and ascertaining information and keeping it, and my research into technology. Some of that research focus goes into things such as gaming and education, the history of the Black diaspora movement, in particular to the Afro-Atlantic history, indigenous history, more so related to the United States, and gaming history and gaming preservation. I recently graduated from the University of Baltimore with my bachelor's, and I will be moving on to receive my master's in teaching special education at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you. This has been a great foray into my ability to blend video games with the fields of history and psychology in order to conduct research into things like gaming therapy, the use of video games as an additional teaching tool in teachers' arsenals, as well as ways to figure out how different cultures across the world have utilized video games as a means of reclaiming and reteaching the history of their people. It is a great endeavor that I enjoy, and I look forward to doing it even further in the future. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of how games have been used as a means of creating these social connections and used as a tool in both therapeutic and educational practice, let's start with a quick little story. And that story, I would like for you guys to have some input. So I wanted to ask you, the audience, a few questions so that we can all have a dialogue, because I believe that's what my presentation in general would like. An audience whose dialogue can be heard around the world as we continue to use games as an additional tool for education. So for starters, how many of you have been playing video games for a long time during the COVID pandemic? Fair enough. I guess the next question would be like, how come, or what kind of games? Were they single-player games? Were they role-playing games? Shooters? Yes.
I guess I split my time between, I could probably say so, like Destiny 2 as like a cooperative with friends on Discord, and for single-player, I just got into, or at the time, the Legend of Heroes Trail series on recommendation from a friend.
Oh my God.
That was also a bit of a collaborative because, like, as I was playing, I was discussing it with him and other people.
Oh my gosh, I gotta get into the Trail series.
It's good.
I've heard. Yes.
Lots of Animal Crossing.
Yeah, that's about right. And one more. Yes.
Played a lot of Left 4 Dead 2 with my friends online. Put like 300 hours during the first month of the pandemic on.
So as we've heard, a lot of us have been playing various multiplayer games. Some have been playing single-player games, sure. But a lot of it had to do with playing with people, whether it's people you know or perhaps people you don't know. A lot of my kids' examples have been a lot of playing role-playing games or first-person shooters, particularly things like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Left 4 Dead. These are things I've heard around the classroom, and it's been showing. I teach predominantly 6th and 7th grade, and a lot of them got into those during the pandemic as a means of getting closer to each other. So my next question would be, what games during that time left a lasting impression on you? It doesn't have to necessarily be something like very emotionally impactful like the next Saga. It could just be some stupid dorky thing that happened during the match, or it could be something small but meaningful. Yes.
I think like my friend of friends, I think there was a really interesting moment with Animal Crossing. Like I went on a first date in Animal Crossing. We're on the phone, it's like, let me see your house. Let me see here's my house. It's like, oh, meet my villagers.
Hellblade.
Hellblade. Ooh.
Yeah. Had never seen a game do that with audio, had never seen a game really try to do what Hellblade does with representation of mental illness. I can't speak to how accurate it was, but it certainly made an impression.
I'm gonna hold off on that because I will be talking about Hellblade just a little bit towards the end. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And do one more. Yes. Yes.
Alright, yeah, I played Persona 5 Royal in
Yes!
less than 3 months, almost 300 hours in the game, and the third semester, that was definitely, no spoilers, but it was definitely a lot to think about during COVID.
To that point, I will also be talking about Persona 5 Royal. I will be getting into a little bit of the third semester, particularly the story route of Kasumi. So if you don't want to hear, I'll just let you know ahead of time. You'll see the picture. And I guess we kind of already went into the third question. But how many of you have mostly been playing single-player games during the pandemic? Okay. Multiplayer games. And a mixture of both. Kind of like 50-50, 49-51. Okay. So it kind of looks like a lot more people have been playing single player, but multiplayer isn't necessarily off the table. That was not what I was expecting. I did, just as a side note, I recently conducted a survey. I got 25 responses from people, and a lot of them said that they've played multiplayer games during the pandemic as a means of connecting with people or just games that they themselves naturally play. And now that they have the perfect excuse, the pandemic, to get further into it, they have an even greater reason to keep that social connection. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So I appreciate everyone giving me their responses because I would like to give you my story. So not recently, during the start of the pandemic, that March or April, I was trying to clear out my gaming shelf, but of course, nostalgia got in the way. And one of the games that caught my eye was Devil Survivor Overclocked. It's, the first time I played it, was an amazing game. So I haven't played it for a while at that point. And by the time I was able to finish the game again, it left a lasting impression on me that was way more relevant during the pandemic than it was back in 2013. I was remembering the original release. Everything ranging from rationing to the loss of power and resources to the collapse of a society to, of course, police brutality. A lot of these things have been felt during the pandemic. Everything from social movements to the loss of basic decency to the loss of basic human needs. And everyone has been affected by these things. So for a game from the late 2000s to the early 2010s to leave a lasting impression that can be felt well into the next decade is going to be something that we need to discuss. Because this isn't just the only game that has done that, and it won't be the last. The reason why I'm particularly talking about role-playing games, though, and some of its relatives, like action-adventure games or roguelikes, is because role-playing games foster the ability to teach people various things, both academically as well as socially. Various RPGs, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons, Nier Automata, Fire Emblem, can be greatly used as a means of fostering these relationships and knowledge in a multitude of ways combined with traditional education and therapeutic practice. And the makings of a hero pertain to a lot of all these elements. Everything from going from that hero's journey to keeping those lasting memories. This can be applied easily to real life, and it starts early with the kids. RPGs of all kinds have been beneficial to human development, as evidenced in these extracurricular, clinical, and educational settings. They're very important because they provide for us a low-risk assessment and setting for everyone to learn, not just kids, but also adults. And they allow us to grow both as individuals and as a community. And this allows for people who are more traditionally inclined to play these types of games to develop a more positive socio-emotional development rather than those who don't routinely play these types of games. So, with that being said, I'd like for the audience to be able to analyze, interpret, and reflect on all of these various RPGs and their benefits as a means of entertainment, yes, but also as a tool of connections, education, and as a tool of the human experience. Some of these objectives I would like to have include observing the problems that the United States faces with mental health and education, and examining the results of said problems currently observable today. These problems will range from everything from the founding of education, American education, in the mid to late 19th century, all the way to the present day, where we get to see those ideas from the 19th century being applied today. And we will be able to interpret and deduce the merits and limitations RPGs can have as both a tool in therapy and education. So, before we get to talk about how games have been beneficial in these areas, we first need to examine that history. And it starts with the mishandling of mental health and education in the United States. Mental health and the quality of it in the US is at a devastating low. For starters, we lack access to equitable education in the United States, following major laws in the steps to improve it, such as Brown versus Board, particularly for students of color and those who fall under special education needs. This has been increasing as we get further and further away from the idea of education for all. An idea that we've had starting in the mid to late 19th century and has been continuously decreasing over time. As a result, the rise in bigotry, domestic terrorism, and climate change and political strife has resulted in a United States population that is brimming with trauma and despair. The COVID pandemic itself has worsened these conditions, not create them, all to a distressing degree, leaving everyone feeling the stress and the trauma for years to come. So let's talk about the idea, education for all, because it's not necessarily true depending on who you ask. So for the audience, I would like to propose a few questions. For starters, what does education mean to you? Who do you think of when you think of education for all? Do you think of someone who comes from the rich? Do you think of someone who comes from a modest background? What about their ethnicity? What about their race? Do you even know about the history of education for these particular types of people in the United States. No one?
Well, the knee-jerk reaction when I think of education for all would be like how grade school is mandatory for children and like the no child left behind program, which doesn't really work, and things like that. But then like second thought would be like how further education is not really accessible to like normal people, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
You go. So when I hear that phrase, education for all, I look at the nature of how different school districts are funded in ways that do not always match the needs of the kids in the school districts. You know, in certain areas, they are horrendously underfunded and need significantly more, whereas you look at other areas where it's less of a need, but they've got more money as a result of, I'm not too knowledgeable on this, property taxes, stuff like that, I think.
I agree. I would say as an educator from Baltimore City, I wholeheartedly agree. And it is very noticeable. I can easily go from Penn North to Charles Village and see the prosperity there versus going to Sandtown or Pigtown, where some of the schools in the area barely have basic things like AC and heating, non-rotten food, or textbooks that aren't outdated. We still see textbooks from the mid to early 1900s that are extremely outdated, still being used across the United States. And this has created various knowledge gaps that may or may not actually be able to be healed. Anyone else? You all the way in the back.
Your question at first was about like what everyone's idea of the prototypical educator is. And it's kind of ironic coming from me as an educator myself, but I think the future of education should be less about individual people disseminating it and more about having an open source collective of knowledge that we can use for the betterment of humanity.
That has been an idea that I've been pondering all throughout my 5 years for school, because the advent of technology and the internet has ultimately opened that Pandora's box. When you have the free and open source internet, you can't really teach the same way you've done in the 1800s or the 1900s. It just doesn't work. We can't keep gatekeeping people from education when we have what should have been the great equalizer in that pursuit. Whether or not it is or will be, though, that depends on us. So my second question, and we kind of already touched on this idea, do you feel like you've been adequately prepared for the world following your grade school education? What are some shortfalls that you've encountered, like immediately after 12th grade or whatever grade you stopped at?
Well, they thought it was important for us to know, like, how to balance a checkbook, which I've never done a single day after like 7th grade. But like, they didn't teach us about basic geography of other countries. Like, I was very fortunate. My friend actually told me, like, when I was like, oh, I want to go to Africa. She's like, cool, what part of it? I was like, what? She's like, yeah, it's not like it is in the movies. Like, what part of Africa? And like, never looked at a map before she asked me that. Of like they were just like, oh yeah, Africa, you don't need to worry about that. You need to worry about America right here.
Indeed. And I think it's funny how we look at Africa, a continent,
Yeah.
and we think of Africa, like there's just a one-stop shop. But we know Portugal, Spain, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, but we don't just say, I want to go to Europe. Or if we do, we are immediately able to specify which country.
Yeah.
And one more.
Me?
Yes.
I think
a lot of school, it doesn't focus on teaching you things like budgeting, it doesn't teach you taxes, it doesn't teach you how to pay rent, it doesn't teach you how to prioritize or how to make actual decisions for yourself. You go into school a lot of times and it's very rigid, especially depending on what kind of school you went to, whether it was private, a boarding school, or a public school, which that is a whole load of things because that, where you go, sets you up for how you're going to do and what opportunities you have access to, which already isn't fair. On top of some of these other schools, they do teach you these things like prioritizing, paying rent, how to do your taxes, while most public schools don't, and that's not fair, and you're set so far below on providing for yourself and building a home, an environment for yourself in the future.
Yeah. And when rent is skyrocketing to the point where we can't even rent or own a house anymore, I have to explain this to my uncle, who's thankfully able to have all these things. I got a different reaction from my uncle versus my parents. My uncle, he saw the writing on the wall, and he was immediately pissed. As a veteran who went and allegedly fought for like American prosperity, hearing his grandnephew talk about how he has to work 3 jobs in order to make a basic income, kind of disheartening and disillusioning. Whereas my parents are still like hopeful, but kind of ignorant on the situation. And when there's basically the size of that speaker there to that post there as your $4,000 a month house. Thanks, New York. Yeah, I think I want to learn what rent is and how to pay it very quickly, because that might be the only thing I can afford for the rest of my life. And to that point, we've already answered the third one from various people. What are some things you wish were taught to you? Or what do you think some things should have been taught to you in a different way? Yes. Yes.
The first thing that comes to mind, besides all the other, actual practical, useful ones that can help protect me financially, my AP Lit class, which I did not get any college credit for. You had to do AP Lit for that. AP Lit actually let me pick books I wanted to read, and we never had the curtains are blue for a reason conversation, right? We actually were asked by that particular teacher I had, what do you think it means? What does it mean to you? How does it resonate with you? Or if we had a puzzle, like a mystery book, it was like, why do you think the things you think? But it taught me critical thinking in a way every other literature English class I had never did, which was, read this book and it means what I say because I say it. Like, that AP Lit class was the first time I ever felt like I had a voice in my own education.
I'm sorry about that fact that is all too common. I'm sorry, as someone who wants to educate people in this country, that this is something that is going to become very common in the foreseeable future and beyond. And I'm sorry for the fact that as someone who has to learn how games are designed and how they are written in ways that utilize that tool of agency, both in education and for gaming, I'm sorry for the fact that it's not even more common and that people who had that epiphany like you did aren't actually in either of those industries to allow people to understand and learn more about critical thinking and not just learning about what the thing is, but why the thing is. So we're going to talk about a little bit more about that. The idea of a learned republic, the idea of that shining beacon on the hill that we set out for in the first place but failed so spectacularly, it can make someone's corpse spin in their coffin. Prior to the mid-19th century, education was limited in readied access to the aristocracy or the merchant class. While public education did exist in the early on parts of the United States, privatized education existed before the United States was even formed. It existed in the colonies. It was easier to just pay someone to privately educate you than it was to educate everyone. How can you have a shining beacon on a hill when most of your people are illiterate and starving? Social activism, as a result, needed to be created. And by the mid-19th century onward, it propelled its way into the public sphere to start creating what we would think of as education. Now, when I asked that first question early on about what do you think of or who do you think of in American education, it was for a reason. Because American education, I think, comes in various fronts. Black education, Western education, indigenous education, and special education. There are various other perspectives to look at it from, but I want to concentrate on those four for a reason, because they've propelled itself into the public zeitgeist, and regardless of which path you take, they kind of all led to the same end of disenfranchisement and shortchanging us. Now, public policy and legislation made it possible for taxes to be used in public schools to establish them from the mid to late 1800s. This was something that would be created by men like Horace Mann, who educators today refer to as the father of American education. For the Black Front, we have Black women and religious organizations like the Quakers to thank for our ability to be educated. They championed the necessity of educating the Black population throughout the 19th century. Indeed, it was women who were mostly involved in that. And this would come to be even more apparent as the centuries moved on. And indigenous activists, freedom fighters, and community leaders would fight for their way of life throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in the face of manifest destiny and its terrible after effects that we can still feel to this day. This has resulted in a gradual foundation of American education in a variety of forms. So early on, I mentioned Horace Mann, who was well regarded in education for being the father of American education. Following his elected position to the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837, he sought to create a non-secular education for the entirety of the United States to follow. This resulted in various people from all walks of life to be able to do things like reading, writing, and arithmetics. He called it the Common School Movement. This would be what we refer to as public school for years to come. On the Black front, again, women were the ones who were largely responsible, but it wasn't just them, it was also men. And they worked in common following the Civil War to establish Black culture, African and African American studies, and just what it meant to be a Black person in a country that didn't really represent you. Women like the first Black psychologist, Dr. Inez Beverly Prosser, would set out to change what it meant to be educated as a Black person in the United States. Her dissertation was on the establishment of what we would today refer to as HBCUs, or just Black institutions. The result was that those who chose to be segregated, in her words, had a better time actually creating self-worth and better education for themselves because they weren't needlessly compared to their white counterparts. This didn't mean that integrated schools were a bad thing. It just meant that, well, you're kind of better with your own. It didn't necessarily mean you didn't have to explore that, but of course, people who look, think, and had the same issues as you did would be able to relate to you more, and that's what we lost as a result of modern education. Teachers that were able to think like us. And this applies to everyone, not just race. To that point of race and education, we also have to look at the history of indigenous education, because oftentimes we look at the Pilgrims, we look at how they helped each other alongside the natives, and then they just made like the elves in Lord of the Rings and went to the Dying Lands. Which is kind of shit, to be honest, because there's a lot of rich and dark and terrible things that happened for, what, 200 years that we don't talk about? I can tell you, as someone who went to Baltimore City, I went to school with old heads. I went to school with people who would teach us the things that won't be taught for the rest of society. We talked about King Philip's War in the 2nd grade. Never again will we talk about that. And it was the first war that set the way we think of Native Americans for the rest of American history as violent savages that need to be exterminated for the great white race. And we still have that issue when we had the discussion of residential schools. It is unfortunate that various Canadians had to go and find the corpses of over 200 children in a ditch underneath a school. And it is even more unfortunate that this is going to be even more common when archaeologists start finding the schools that weren't talked about, not just in Canada, but in all across the Americas, both continents. Activists like Vine Delore Jr. would make it their mission, their life's work, to create these institutions necessary to teach about American Indian studies. In fact, it was him that started the first American Indian degree program in the United States in, I believe, the 1950s. Lastly, I would like to talk about special education and the role Helen Keller played in its establishment, and more importantly, the history we don't talk about with Helen Keller. We don't talk about how she was an activist for socialism, workers' rights, or for the need to create better institutions for the common masses, rather than fulfilling a war machine that will ultimately suck the public good dry for years to come. And it's even worse because people will hold women like Helen Keller up as a pillar for disabled people to establish themselves as, when some people just can't reach that. And even worse, you're romanticizing the history of the struggle. My sister said it best when she was talking about the struggle of Black people and their role in changing the American zeitgeist. You want all of our jazz, but you don't want the blues. Indeed, the fight for equitable education for all led to a variety of cultural changes. Black education would see a major influence from the Afro-Atlantic negritude and Black is Beautiful movements. It was a rich history. People like Mary McLeod Bethune, people like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, they would change what it meant to be Black in this country. And they would also change what it meant to be taught as a Black person in this country for years to come. The Marion Report, likewise, for Indigenous education led the spark to be ignited in what would become the American Indian movement. The report found heinous acts committed inside of these residential schools, including child labor, child torture and torment, and forcing the culture out of the savage in order to save the man. This is something that will be continued for years to come because the last residential school in the Americas closed in 1997. This wasn't something that was a long time ago. This was something that stopped a year before I was born. And then special schools for the blind and deaf would lead positive and negative discussions on the viewpoint of the disabled and learning disabilities and how they fared against physical ones. And in this instance, this is something that's important to me personally. One of my distant ancestors, Barbara Rose Johns Powell, led the student protest at the all-Black Moulton High to fight for desegregation in schools. In Farmville, Virginia, she led an all-students movement at the age of 16 to do this. The NAACP would take this case up, and it would be the only student protest that created the culminated case of Brown versus Board of Education. She wouldn't be remembered because she was 16 doing this, not someone who was an adult. And it hurt me when one of my kids in 7th grade told me that he couldn't change anything because he's just a kid. I told him he was wrong, and I'm showing you now that it was wrong. And it's a shame that kids have to do this, and they will keep doing it until they're heard. Speaking of these horrors, the horrors found in residential schools were numerous and varied. And it ranged from everything from cultural assimilation to stabbing out the tongues of the children who would speak in their indigenous languages. Languages that, thankfully, games today have been trying to save For those who played Nier Automata, there was an ending theme for Weight of the World that was sung in Chamikuro, an indigenous language now defunct in South America. The last speaker of it died in the 2010s, and he was also the last member of the Chamikuro people. I am glad that they were able to save the language in the only popular medium known today, but it's a shame that more indigenous people don't get a seat at the table to preserve it on their own stakes. This is also a good conversation to have about video game preservation and the need to do it more, because now we know that video games can preserve an entire people's history, the only history that'll be saw for years to come. And it would be men like the First Nations chief, Edmund Metatuaben, born in 1948, who would fight for these rights. And he would experience the first horrors when he attended St. Anne's, a Canadian residential school, for 8 years, between 1956 and 1964. And this is where the intersectionality of race and disability played a key role in understanding education. Following the Civil War in Maryland, for example, white Americans who were disabled would be segregated from the black disabled students. And this would be felt well into the 20th century, when you have individuals having to not only fight for desegregation based off of race, but also disability. Social activists like Johnny Lacey had to fight for the right to be taught in higher education, and her movement would be felt in the establishment of various laws that allow everyone to go to college or university. Despite these sacrifices, though, the idea of education for all has still not been realized. The US spends more money on non-educated related tasks like school resource officers rather than things like social workers or teachers or updated textbooks or the ability to eat non-rotten food. Education should inspire us all to learn. So tell me this, which one is more useful, Latin or home economics? Guess which one is taught most?
Latin.
And for someone who went to Baltimore City College, one of the oldest institutions that teaches high school, it's a shame that that wasn't something that was taught to me. Instead, we had to learn how to say the Pledge of Allegiance in Latin.
What?
I wish it was more useful. I wish that, unless if the Romans come back tomorrow, sorry.
We spend all of our money teaching a dead language that no one speaks anymore, right?
GG's. And unfortunately, this isn't something that's felt by the students, but the teachers as well. Teacher burnout has become a greater problem following the Reagan administration. By 2018, for example, despite teachers in the US working long, grueling hours compared to their counterparts overseas, about 9 to 10 hours, give or take, unfortunately, it's not really worth their time or the money. When you have a master's or a doctorate degree and you're making less than what you know you're worth, what are you doing? It's better to be a high school teacher nowadays than to even be an adjunct professor. Between traditional, indigenous, vocational, religious, and private or homeschooling, we just failed in education. We failed people like Horace Mann. We failed people like Dr. Inez Beverly Prosser. We failed people like W.E.B. Du Bois. We failed the kids that come after us. We failed. That's it. And to that point, we should also talk about mental health, because the two often intertwine with one another. So the pandemic itself has brought on a lot of mental health topics to light. Do you feel as though America is currently capable of realizing the need for better mental health discussions? I don't even need to ask why or why not. I've seen it firsthand. And considering that everyone else is not looking the most sure about that, I guess you have too.
I think it's more of a priority for those of us who are younger than our parents and our grandparents.
I wish that was wrong. And to that point, how many of you live in an area without adequate means of receiving mental health care? How many of you wish you did live in a place that had these facilities? Things like a relatable therapist, things like community mental health practice, things like just feeling the need to say that I'm vulnerable. Thankfully, it's been getting better. Thankfully, it's not the same that it's been in the 1900s. But the bar is in hell, and even further than that. How many of you turned to telehealth as a result? Interesting question. That's something that's popped up a lot during the pandemic. Just opening your phone, opening an app, something like Better Health.
I actually can't drive for like health reasons, and had to take the bus, like before COVID, I had to take the bus, like 2 different bus trips because my county hates buses and so it sucks, in order to get to my therapist every week. And oddly enough, COVID and the shutdown of everything and the creation of encouragement of telehealth, like made mental health more accessible to me. It was weird.
Yeah.
I didn't have to travel anymore, which was nice.
What about you?
So I work as a therapist, and there's been an ongoing discussion in the community about, how telehealth has changed the landscape, and one major aspect of that is talk about how certain areas are inaccessible, their mental health care is inaccessible, and how telehealth is one large aspect of addressing it, as well as for people who, whether you live in a place or not, if you're the therapist that you connect best with, that is the best fit for you, if they're 3 buses away, then that's inaccessible for this person. If you have chronic illness, whatever, telehealth is an answer to it.
Indeed. I agree that it's an answer to that. And I agree that it's the best panacea that we've had in terms of mental health. But I am also aware of the damages that it's already done. Unfortunately, when most of your clientele don't actually represent the whole of what the US has to offer, when they only target a specific demographic, like other parts of healthcare, yay, that's fun. Then you still create an even bigger problem for yourself. I remember watching an interview where the interviewer was asking questions to the AI about suicidal ideation, and the AI responded, "I too would like to go to bed." Wow, that's cool. So, needless to say, AI and telehealth kind of need some help along the way. Yeah, I wish more people were actually behind the screen. And there are, but there needs to be a group that represents everyone. The development of mental health facilities, the way we think of them, was started in the 60s by the Kennedy administration with the signing of the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. It was the act created both as a need for the cultural zeitgeist at the time, and for Kennedy himself, something that was related to him personally, as his sister, Rosemary, also suffered from intellectual disabilities, as well as a lobotomy by her good caring parents. The goal of the Community Mental Health Act was to institute the ability to research, prevent, and later treat mental health when they realized that you couldn't just cure depression. You couldn't just cure schizophrenia. It's something that stays with you for the rest of your life. It's just a question of, do you want more of it now or less of it later? And it's done in various means of medication, therapy, and just having a community that has good knowledge and understanding, both a good healthcare community and a general community. The result his team had hoped would be the establishment of a successful mental health industry, one capable of diagnosing, treating, and educating the public. Well, it was better than what we had before that. The manifestation of modern psychology was brought forth via a mixture of heinous activities and genuine knowledge. Alongside things like the idea of therapeutic practice, the idea of giving rights to the patient, was also things like stabbing your brain until it started working to the way society intended you, or instituting you based upon your sexual organs rather than you actually having, you know, a mental health disability or not. And unfortunately, that's where we were at for quite some time between the 1800s to the mid to late 1900s. The signing of the Community Mental Health Act had led to the creation of a better system, one that we would have thought that we would benefit from for days and years to come. But the collapse of mental health care in America from the Reagan administration onward led to a variety of downfalls, everything to the problems associated with deinstitutionalization to just not funding the community mental health facilities properly. There's a lot more that can be talked about for that, but that's just a general vibe that I can give you. And from example, a 2022 report from the Committee of Finance found that there are over 6,000 shortage areas for therapists, social workers, psychiatrists, just anything you can think of. A report from 2021 showcased the lack of professional Black mental health professionals in the industry. And when your therapist doesn't really jive with you, you're gonna not really want to go to therapy anymore for anyone. And the result is a mental health industry that's just now broken in the way it thinks, feels, and acts. When your prisons start becoming the new asylums that we were trying to avoid back in the 60s, that's a problem. And it's created a very terrible condition for us. A lot of people, for example, will look at things like social anxiety as, oh, you're just nervous, you're just scared, you're just sad, which is terrible because a study that examined over 6,000 children from 7 various states ultimately found that a third of those kids, regardless of where they were from, would face or already face social anxiety disorder. And when your community mental health facilities aren't funded properly, this is the result. Your community just doesn't know what to do, what to say, or what to think. And this has created a lack of empathy in the United States. Think about the George Floyd protests. Think about the HBCU bomb threats that still haven't been talked about after a year of just letting it loom and wane. Nothing's been done. The country is tired. And when you have a lot of terrible things happen to the American public over and over and over again, people just learn to go numb. They don't want to listen anymore. That's why when we had a president say that COVID is over, despite a new variant being announced before the new year even started, people just said, fuck it, I'll die at this point. Because at this point, when you're telling me that all is lost, that's what's gonna happen. If you tell someone that they're a monster, they'll just become a monster. But there's a fix to this, or at least a Band-Aid, something better than what we have now. This is where we get to talk about the intersection of role-playing games and the common zeitgeist. Things like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, have allowed for introverted, quiet kids to have a place to talk and play together, while at the same time still being fueled for the fire by religious fanatics who looked at D&D as a tool to worship Satan. And unfortunately, when you have someone who played D&D commit suicide, you know how that's going to turn. The writer immediately turned that as fuel for the fire. But thankfully, it didn't stay for too long. But moral panics usually don't have to. They just stay for long enough until they permeate into the American psyche. We still have terrible things to think about that were outdated in their time back in the 1900s as they are now. But we can also use these games for good. For example, the use of MMOs can be used to study various complex economic theories. We can give kids the fun way of studying economics while also just playing around a World of Warcraft. It's fun. It's better than just looking at a bland textbook all day, and you can easily apply it to real life. This is when life is fun in games. The gaming industry is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Last year, it made nearly $185 billion by December 2022. It made a lot of difference in people's lives. It made for a lot of people to play video games. 72% of men between 18 to 29 played video games at this time. And women weren't that far behind either. So it's clearly something that everyone likes and enjoys. And this is where we get to talk about where it's used. Let's look at where it's used for education, for example. And I'll give you a quick story from my end. These are the 3 games I enjoyed playing as a kid. Dynasty Warriors, thanks Cuzzo. Assassin's Creed, specifically 3 at the time, which is where my mom had came in the room and said, "Oh my gosh, you're killing people." Yes, but I'm learning the way of the colonizer and why they did it. Oh, cool, dope, go ahead and learn it. And of course in high school, because I was an edgy bitch, Shin Megami Tensei 4, which gave me a lot of insight into various mythologies from around the world. All 3 were great resources, and we could actually use a lot of these to teach things like history, culture, and literature, while also teaching them things like how to communicate with one another, how to foster these connections. And commercial games in particular are great at this because they weren't intended to do these things like serious games. We could actually learn a thing or two from them instead of just making a game to answer the problem. We could figure out how things that weren't meant to answer the problem fit into our current way of life. For example, when I was talking about Assassin's Creed 3, there were other games that came out for it, including Liberation and Freedom Cry. These gave the idea of American history from the eyes of people we normally don't think of, such as Aveline de Grandpré, who was an Afro-French woman. We don't really get to talk about the history of colonial America from the eyes of a black woman in Louisiana. We don't get to talk about the history from the eyes of the Mohawk people like Raton Haketon or Connor. And we get that perspective from him, or Adewale in the Caribbean. These were 3 great protagonists that kind of just came out the 2010s, which was a very weird decade for games that we get to know today. We also have Never Alone, which was an indie game made by Native people in Alaska. And it gives us a good indication of their culture because they themselves made it. Versus Ubisoft, who did give them input, but there's a difference between letting an entire community make it and letting 1 or 2 key people make it. We also have games like Devil Summoner Soul Hackers, which used a lot of native and cultural infused ideas into their game. Kaneko played a lot around with the idea of things like Manitou and Algonquin myth with the cyber world that we get to enjoy today. This was a game made in '97, and it got a lot of things right, like our dependence on the internet or VR culture. And we also have The Raven and the Light, which was an indie game that gives us that horror experience while also teaching us about residential schools. My kid back in 6th grade also looked at the comparisons between Greek and Norse mythology. And there's actually a whole study about that, looking at Proto-Indo-European history. We get to look at how Aphrodite came from women like Ishtar, Ashtarte, and Aphrodite Aria, or Aphrodite Urania, or Aphrodite Pandemos. We get to learn about epithets, etymology. It's fun. And this isn't a game that was made to be like that, but it is. This is what happens when you create games that also know what they're doing with the culture and history. Tabletop games are also great at this, but they're also great at teaching things like communication, arithmetic, and just learning how to balance your actions through things like action economy. We also get to see this in indigenous history, looking at ways how games like Nordic LARP get to teach us about understanding the struggles of various peoples, while at the same time also being something that was made for fun. It's great, and we can also use this as a tool in therapy, an idea of role-playing while at the same time making it educational. And when you do these things, you get to have the acts of things like Final Fantasy XIV players understand the loss during the pandemic, where various players from around the world came to watch a funeral for a player they didn't even know, but they just knew that the people were on the other side of the screen were grieving. That's when you have a tight-knit community. Or looking at things like Nordic LARP understand the plight of the Palestinians. Or looking at things like ending E of Nier Automata and sacrificing all of your player data for someone you don't know, but you know that it helped. Or looking at how Ghost of Tsushima players raised $260,000 to restore the island's shrine, and how their names are now engraved into that shrine. This was during a time where they had a lot of disasters happen on that island, and players from around the world came to help. Or looking at how Fire Emblem Three Houses understands the ways in which people with suicidal ideation deal with their thoughts through the power of faith. Because before we had therapists, we had priests. And at that time, people had to learn how to just deal with life raw, because we didn't have medication yet. And thankfully, the game doesn't shy away from that fact, because when you don't have the essential needs to make sure that you're actually thinking straight and knowing yourself and being whole, bad things can happen. If you don't recruit Marianne by the middle of the game, it's heavily implied that she dies by taking her own life. And when you talk to people like Dimitri and get their support conversation all the way through, you learn that Dimitri just tells you sometimes you can't just be mad at yourself all the time. And sometimes you just don't need to regret your own actions all the time. Things that are bad just happen. It has nothing to do with you. But more importantly, he doesn't just say everything will be okay, because it won't be okay. You don't know that. Or things like Byleth, who ironically is the goddess that came to answer her prayers. You can also look at the way Hellblade uses sound design and the way that it talks about mental health and violence. It doesn't demonize the relationship between violence and looking at people with mental health problems. If anything, it uses the violence that the game has as a means of understanding where Senua is coming from, and also using it as a tool of catharsis, just letting go of your problems. And looking at Kasumi's awakening process from still referring her, if you don't want spoilers, looking at the way Kasumi, or rather Sumire, finally understands herself and is able to actually awaken her persona. And not only that, her persona is the person she impersonated. And now she can finally have a healthy relationship. We can all be heroes in this situation. We can all use the power of games to teach ourselves and each other, to foster community, to learn, to grow. And it just starts with us. We can give that prosperity to people who come after us. We can give that prosperity for people who come after us for years to come. It's not a panacea for mental health or education, but it's a great tool to have. The question is, do you want to press start, or do you want to quit? Thank you.